Snow fell in thick white sheets across the small train station at the edge of Wyoming. It was the kind of cold that bit through gloves and froze the air inside your lungs. The station was nearly empty now. The last train had gone hours ago, its smoke long vanished into the dark horizon. Only one person still sat on the wooden bench beside the tracks. A young woman wrapped in a thin coat, shivering as if her bones were made of glass. Her name was Clara, a nurse who had come from Kansas with a letter and a dream. For weeks she had believed she was coming west for a new job. The letter said a new hospital was being built in the valley and they needed trained nurses. She had spent all her savings on a ticket. The man who wrote the letter promised to meet her at the station, but no one came. Now the station master had gone home. The lanterns were dim and the floorboards creaked with the wind. She rubbed her hands together, trying to stay awake. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. She whispered softly to herself just to hear a human voice. "It will be morning soon," she said. But her voice trembled. Morning still felt far away. The sound of the wind beating against the windows was the only answer she got. Clara had been brave once. She had worked in war hospitals, holding the hands of wounded soldiers, comforting them until they fell asleep. She had seen suffering before, but loneliness like this was new. She thought of her mother's face, of the home she left behind, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake coming here. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. She closed her eyes for a moment, her body numb. Just when she began to drift into a cold, dizzy sleep, she heard something strange, an engine rumbling in the distance. Not a train, a truck? The sound grew closer until headlights flashed through the storm, cutting through the snow. The truck stopped near the platform and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and hat pulled low. His boots crunched on the snow as he walked toward her. He paused for a moment as if unsure what he was seeing. "Ma'am, you all right?" His voice was deep, calm, and carried through the wind. Clara tried to answer, but her lips were too cold to move. She managed a faint sound that was more a sigh than a word. Her fingers barely twitched. He saw the frost on her hair, the pale color of her skin, and he didn't waste another second. "Hold on," he said, kneeling beside her. "You're freezing." He took off his thick coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he could lift a horse. She tried to speak, whispering something about waiting for someone, but he shook his head. "No one's coming tonight," he said quietly. "You'll freeze if you stay here." He lifted her carefully, one arm behind her back, the other beneath her knees. She was so light it startled him. Snow blew hard against his face as he carried her to his truck and opened the door. He laid her inside, started the engine, and turned the heater up full. As the warmth spread, color began to return to her cheeks. She looked at him through half-open eyes, her voice weak. "You don't even know me," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Don't have to. Just know you needed help." His name was James Carter, known around the valley as the Millionaire Cowboy. People called him that because he owned more land than anyone for miles. But he never lived like a rich man. He wore the same old hat he'd had since his 20s, drove his own truck, and worked his ranch with the same effort as his hired hands. Years ago, he had lost his wife to illness, and since then he had chosen to live quiet, avoiding parties, avoiding people. Work had become his way of keeping busy so he wouldn't think too much. But as he drove through the snow with this half-frozen nurse beside him, something inside him stirred again. She was so still, so fragile, but there was courage in her eyes even through the exhaustion. They reached his ranch just before dawn. The house stood on a hill, warm light spilling from the windows. Smoke curled from the chimney. His housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, opened the door as soon as she heard the truck. Her gray hair was tucked under a scarf and her face showed both surprise and concern. "Good heavens, James. What happened?" she cried. "Found her at the train station," he said simply, carrying Clara inside. "She's half frozen. Get blankets, hot water, anything warm." Mrs. Dalton hurried to obey. Together they worked quickly, rubbing Clara's hands, wrapping her in quilts, placing warm stones near her feet. After a while, her shivering slowed. Her eyes fluttered open again, confused but alive. "Where am I?" she whispered. "In my home," James said softly. "You're safe now." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled faintly. "You saved me," he shook his head. "Just did what anyone should do." But deep down, they both knew not everyone would have stopped in a storm like that. For the next few days, Clara stayed in a small guest room while she recovered. She slept long hours and woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of horses outside. The ranch was busy even in winter, men tending to cattle, mending fences, chopping wood. From her window she could see the wide white fields stretching into the horizon. James came by each morning to check on her, sometimes bringing her breakfast, sometimes just asking how she felt. He spoke with a calm kindness that made her feel safe. Mrs. Dalton said he wasn't used to talking much to anyone since his wife passed, but he seemed to talk easily with Clara. As the days went by, she grew stronger. She began helping Mrs. Dalton in the kitchen, washing dishes, feeding the hens, anything to repay their kindness. One afternoon, she followed James outside to the barn. He was fixing a broken gate, his sleeves rolled up, his hands rough and steady. "You shouldn't be working in this cold," she said with a smile. He looked up, returning the smile. "And you shouldn't be standing out here without gloves." She laughed softly, the sound clear and light. "Guess we're both stubborn." He liked the sound of her laughter. It had been years since the house had heard something that warm. One evening, as another snowstorm rolled across the plains, James was in the barn again, checking the horses. The wind rattled the doors and snow slipped in through the cracks. Suddenly, he saw a lantern light appear behind him. It was Clara. She stepped carefully across the floor, holding the lantern high. "You shouldn't be out here," he said gently. "The storm's bad." "I heard the roof creaking," she replied. "Thought you might need another pair of hands." He chuckled quietly. "You're a nurse, not a ranch hand." "Maybe," she said, smiling, "but I can hold a lantern." Together they worked, tightening ropes, covering feed, and making sure the horses were safe. When they finished, they stood near the stable door, breath visible in the cold air. Snow blew around them like dust in the lantern light. Clara looked up at him. "I still can't believe a stranger would do all this for me." James shook his head. "You weren't a stranger that night, just someone who needed help." Her eyes softened. "And why were you out that late?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "I couldn't sleep. I was thinking of my wife. She used to say I couldn't stay away from the snow. Guess she was right." Clara lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry. Don't be," he said. "Life goes on even when it hurts." There was silence for a long moment. The storm howled outside, but inside the barn it was warm with the smell of hay and the soft sound of the horses. Clara felt something gentle stir in her heart, a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. When they walked back to the house, he opened the door for her and said, "You'll catch cold if you keep helping me like this." She smiled again, tired but content. "Then you'll just have to save me twice." He laughed softly, the sound echoing in the quiet hall. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind eased, James stood by the window watching the snow fall. For years he had thought the world had nothing left to surprise him, but a nurse lost at a train station had changed that in one night. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew he wanted to find out. And somewhere in the house, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling warmth for the first time in a long while. She didn't know why her heart beat faster when she thought of him, but she knew one thing for certain. She was safe. And maybe, just maybe, she had finally come to the right place. Morning came soft and golden over the snow-covered hills. Clara woke early, as she always did when caring for others. The air in the ranch house smelled of fresh coffee and baked bread. She moved quietly through the kitchen, helping Mrs. Dalton set the table. The older woman smiled as she handed her a bowl. "You're looking stronger every day," she said kindly. Clara smiled back. "It's because of this house. It feels warm, not just from the fire, but from the people inside it." Out the window they could see James out by the stables, already working, though the sun had barely risen. He was leading the horses out to feed, his breath showing white in the air. He always worked hard, even though he could have paid others to do everything for him. Clara had learned that about him. He didn't like being idle, didn't like watching others do what he could do himself. When he came in for breakfast, brushing snow from his hat, Mrs. Dalton gave him a look. "You'll work yourself into the ground if you keep this up," she said. He grinned. "Keeps me young." Then his eyes met Clara's for a brief moment. "Morning, Miss Clara." "Morning, Mr. Carter," she answered softly. They sat down together, the three of them, and the kitchen filled with quiet conversation. James asked about her plans now that she was better. Clara hesitated before answering. I suppose I should try to find another job in town. I can't stay here forever. You can stay as long as you need, James said simply. Mrs. Dalton nodded in agreement. Plenty of work here, and Lord knows we could use another pair of hands. Clara smiled with gratitude. Thank you both. I don't know how to repay your kindness. You already are, Mrs. Dalton said. You brought laughter back to this house, it was true. The house that had once been quiet and still now felt alive again. Clara's soft laughter mixed with the crackling of the fire, and her presence seemed to lighten even the coldest day. James found himself listening for her footsteps, noticing her voice in the next room. He told himself it was simple appreciation, but deep inside he knew it was more. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt, and the first signs of spring appeared on the hills. Clara grew fond of the ranch, the animals, and the life that moved at its own slow rhythm. She loved walking with the horses, feeding the chickens, and talking with the ranch hands who treated her with respect. Everyone could see that their boss looked different now, more at ease, smiling more often. One Sunday, the town church held a small fair to raise money for the local orphanage. Clara insisted they should go. James hadn't been to town for such gatherings in years, but she persuaded him gently. They'll be glad to see you, Mr. Carter. People need to know kindness still lives on these plains. He finally agreed. When they arrived, everyone turned to look. James Carter, the man known for his quiet life, had brought someone with him. A young woman in a simple blue dress, her hair braided neatly, eyes full of warmth. People whispered, curious, but not unkind. Some smiled, others raised eyebrows, but Clara didn't notice. She spent the whole afternoon helping with the children and serving food. James stood nearby, watching her move with such gentle energy that even the coldest hearts seemed to soften. Later that day, a reporter from the town newspaper, who was visiting to cover the fair, overheard someone mention how James had rescued her during the snowstorm. The story caught his attention. Is that true, miss? He found you at the train station? Clara hesitated, unsure what to say, but James nodded. That's right. She would have frozen that night. The reporter smiled. That's something worth printing. A story like that might remind folks there's still goodness in this world. James didn't think much of it, but a few days later the article appeared in the local paper. Millionaire Cowboy saves stranded nurse in snowstorm. The story spread quickly through nearby towns. People sent letters to the ranch thanking them for reminding everyone that compassion still existed. Clara was embarrassed at first, but James found it amusing. Guess we made the papers, he said with a chuckle. She smiled shyly. They make it sound grander than it was. Maybe so, he replied, but you being here feels like something grand to me. His words made her heart skip. She turned away to hide the blush on her cheeks. As spring deepened, Clara began helping more on the ranch. She cared for injured animals, organized medicines for the workers, and kept everyone's spirits high. The men respected her not just for her kindness, but for her courage. One of them said, "She's got the heart of a rancher and the hands of an angel." James heard that and smiled quietly to himself. One evening, they were walking near the corral as the sun dipped behind the hills. The sky was painted in gold and pink, and the air was cool but soft. Clara stopped to watch the light fade over the snow-melted fields. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Never gets old," James said beside her. "But it looks different now." "How so?" she asked. "Guess it's because I'm not looking at it alone." She looked at him, unsure what to say. There was something honest and deep in his voice that went straight to her heart. They stood in silence for a long moment, the evening wind brushing past them. After that day, something between them changed. It was gentle and unspoken, but real. They spent more time together, fixing fences, riding into town for supplies, sitting by the fire in the evenings while he read old books aloud and she listened. Sometimes she would fall asleep in the chair, and he would quietly drape a blanket over her before turning off the lamp. One afternoon, Mrs. Dalton found a letter on the table. It was an offer for Clara to work at a new hospital in Denver. The letter had been sent weeks ago but had arrived late due to the snow. She gave it to Clara, who read it slowly. "It's a good job," Mrs. Dalton said softly. "But leaving won't be easy, will it?" Clara shook her head. "No, it won't. This place, it feels like home." That night she told James about the letter. He listened quietly, staring into the fire. "You should take it if it's what you want," he said finally. She looked down. "I'm not sure what I want anymore." He turned to her, his voice low but steady. When I found you that night, I thought I was helping someone lost in the storm. But truth is, you helped me find my way out of one too." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "James," he shook his head gently. "Don't say anything now. Just think about it. Whatever you choose, I'll be proud of you." The next morning, she stood by the window watching him saddle his horse. The letter lay on her desk unsigned. The fields were green now, the snow long gone, and the world seemed full of promise. She realized then that some people search their whole lives for warmth and never find it. But she had found hers in the middle of a storm. When he came back that evening, she met him at the gate. "I'm not going to Denver," she said. "My work is here. You need someone to keep you out of trouble." He smiled slowly, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. "Then I guess I'm the luckiest cowboy alive." The town learned soon after that Clara had decided to stay. The newspaper wrote another piece, calling it "The Love Story That Melted the Snow." People from far and wide sent letters, some even visiting the ranch just to meet them. But for James and Clara, it wasn't fame that mattered. It was the quiet evenings, the sound of laughter in the kitchen, the peace they had both longed for. Years later, travelers would still talk about the night a lonely nurse met a weary cowboy in a snowstorm, and how their kindness turned into something lasting and true. They built a small clinic on the ranch so Clara could continue her work. Together, they helped the local families, cared for the children, and opened their doors to anyone in need. The world called it a miracle love story. But for them, it was simply life, the way it should be when two hearts meet not by chance, but by purpose. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind swept across the plains, James would look at the stars and remember that frozen evening at the train station. He would turn to Clara, now warm beside him, and say softly, "You were the best thing that ever came off a train." She would laugh and rest her head on his shoulder. "And you were the only man brave enough to stop in the snow." They would sit together in silence then, watching the sky, their hearts still full of the same warmth that had started it all. The world might forget many stories, but theirs stayed alive because kindness never fades, and love, once found, can warm even the coldest winter night.